Russian full-scale invasion to Ukraine started in 2022 unveiled the true face of Russia to the entire world. It also unveiled the face of Rashism, which has not only international characteristics like aggressive expansionism, but also internal ones, such as cultivation of fear of the external enemy, cult of personality, totalitarianism, and severe repressions, as well as the absence of any rule of law, domination of policing as a tool for communication with the people from the state. And, of course, above all of it, the dual reality. When de jure you are a democratic federation state with the system of checks and balances, independent courts, right to protest, and all the other fairy things. And in the reality, however, you are ruled by a criminal figure with a godlike status while expressing any opinion which differs from the official state policy constitutes not only an administrative or even criminal offense, but also brings you to the status of the outlaw, to the status of the enemy of the people, and not just you, but also the entire family of the person who dares to do so.
Пора вводить понятие «враг народа». Не надо этого стесняться. Враги есть, понятия нет. Чего стесняемся? Мне говорят, ты хочешь сталинских репрессий? Я хочу, при том, что мой дед 9 лет отсидел, это хочу напомнить.
It might be challenging to accept that such an ideology might not only exist, but dominate in the civilized 21st century. Yet, we must acknowledge it, and if we dive into the matter deeply, it is clear that domination of Rashism in Russia has not only been possible, but inevitable. In other previous episodes, we have seen how Rashism takes its roots among the motivations of the ordinary Russian people, ideology of the Russian Orthodox Church, and why it blossoms within the Russian culture. Today we are going even further into the subject and see why Rashism is commanded not just by the aspirations of the people, which may come and go, but also dictated by the very design of what today is known as Russian Federation, but de facto stands as Russian Empire. My name is Oleg Stoev. I am Ukrainian lawyer, analyst, World Debate Championship EFL finalist, and humanitarian, working since 2017 to protect victims of Russian aggression against Ukraine. The purpose of this channel is to expose core social, cultural, and political things behind the Russian war against Ukraine, especially those which are most likely to be unclear or misleading from the outside. And today, we dive into the roots of Rashism in the very design of Russian state and its history. How the states are formed? This question might be answered differently, but it must be answered because any group of people have to have a reason to stay together. This is the basis of psychology, sociology, and any political science in general. Generalizing a little bit, there are two scenarios why states exist as they are today. In the first scenario, they do so because they live better together. They do so because they have the shared values and they have an opportunity to live together in dignity. They are also moving to prosperity and they share the common security. Most importantly, they have the same identity which they share. There is, however, the second scenario in which all of these features, such as security, same identity, and movement to prosperity, are unnecessary. The truth is, Russia did never transform. On the contrary, it is moving on a reverse, reaction direction right now, trying to re-establish its control over the states which have managed to break free. And it is often realized by the European, American, and other political analysts. What is left out of the scope, however, is the situation within Russian Federation, as it is called these days. The thing is, It is the same old empire within the borders of Russia, and the celebration of the demise of the prison of nation, the Soviet Union, which the world celebrated in 1991, was premature. The prison did not fall, it just leveled down. Let's play a little game. Take a map of Russia and point literally any part of it, randomly. The thing is, wherever you have pointed, the odds are you are pointing on the territories which have been plundered, colonized, and drawn in blood by Moscovian state, true name of Russia before its rebranding in the 18th century. Let's say you point here, Siberia. I could tell you a story, but just look at the picture instead. It is called Conquering of Siberia under Yermak, kind gentleman whom you can see on the left, who is titled nothing else but Yermak, the Conqueror of Siberia. The campaign took place back in the end of the 16th century, but the spirit of Siberia lives on. After the formal fall of the empire, Siberia proclaimed its sovereignty in 1918. The republic, however, was quickly taken under the control of the same empire, which returned under the new title, the Soviet Union. Or you could have pointed here at Bashkortostan, the land of Salavat Ulayev, who has led the Bashkir people back in the All-Russian Civil War against the imperial regime in the end of the 18th century. Though the leader of the rebellion, Pugachev, has already been caught and the joint army of the rebels has already fallen, Salavat continued to fight. When he was finally captured, the empress sentenced him to lifelong penal servitude and 175 whiplashes. More, his nostrils have been cut off and his face has been marked by fire and iron with the symbols of rebellion and treason, so that no man could approach him. Under a special manifest of Russian emperors, his name has been officially tabooed, so any person who would approach or even say or write the name of Salavat would be prosecuted. Yet years have passed and Bashkortostan still remembers the name of Salavat Ulayev. Not just remembers, but he is a national hero of the Bashkir people and the symbol of Bashkortostan and its will to freedom. Or you could have pointed here at Chechnya. Today it is most known as the land of Ramzan Kadyrov, formerly Russian governor of Chechen Republic within the Russian Federation, and de facto the absolute ruler, famous with his public announcement of the blood feud and the warlord of Putin regime. Previously, however, Chechnya used to be different. It used to be known as the land of freedom and the land of the great Johar Dudayev, the leader of the independent Chechnya under the name of Ichkeria, another state which proclaimed its independence after the fall of the Soviet Empire in 1991. Johar Dudayev led his state in the war with Russia, even though Chechen Republic of Ichkeria was just something near 1.2 million people, while Russia was over 140 million people and had the biggest part of the Soviet army with all the vehicles and all the troops. While Ichkeria had almost no troops, no regular army, it still stood for freedom. Bloody war, which was started by Russian Federation for the name of the territorial integrity, took lives of nearly, or perhaps even more than 300,000 Chechen people. Obviously, most of them have been civilians. They have died because of the bombardment and shelling of the peaceful cities, with the entire city of Grozny and some other cities have been almost completely wiped out from the face of earth. Johar Dudayev has been killed by a targeted missile when he was in a guerrilla regime, hiding in the mountains but still maintaining the fight. The body of Jihad Dudayev might have been destroyed, but his name, his legacy, his spirit lives on among the Chechen people. The other national hero of Chechnya is Sheikh Mansour, first Imam of Caucasus, a leader of the Chechen people in their fight against Russian imperialism and colonization, who has announced jihad or hazavat to the Russian people. Symbolically, two Chechen voluntary military corps which fight in Ukraine right now, these days, are named after the great Jihad Dudayev and Sheikh Mansour. In that way, not only they live on in the hearts of the Chechen people, but also in the hearts of the Ukrainians. Attitude of the Russians towards the Asian part of Russia in general and in their right to sovereignty can be characterized by the words of Russian General Skobiev, who said, "Perspective of peace in Russia is in direct proportion and correlation to the number of the people annihilated there." Getting back to the pointing game. Actually, you can point whenever you want on the map of Russia, because this game is fixed. And you get the message if you have a look on this map representing the states which have proclaimed their independence in 1918 with the formal fall of the empire. It's hard even just to tell the number of the states, but it's safe to say that there have been over 40 of them which have proclaimed independence. The tragedy is, most of these territories have been merged back to Russia, that time in the form of the Soviet Union, merged back with the blood, fire and forced starvation. And so did the Russian Federation, merging back the territories either in the soft way, as it did with the Tatarstan, when Russian Federation deluded it into the signing of treaty under which the Tatarstan enjoyed almost the full sovereignty. And yet, just in the several years, all the document has lost its force. For states and people who have not been persuaded by the soft example of the Tatarstan, they have had the example of the Ichkeria, the independent Chechen Republic, which has been drowned in the blood of its sons and daughters. The showcasing of Russia, just to give you an example of what happens if you want to break through the bars of the prison of nations and claim your own freedom. But it has not only been blood and tears, which is the reason why living in the Russian Federation is generally bad for the Russian people. The most obvious reason why it is bad for absolutely dominant majority of the Russian people to stay within the Russian Federation is colonial exploitation. The truth is, dominant majority of the Russian land has been exploited by Moscow and St. Petersburg. In terms of economics, only Moscow and St. Petersburg are beneficial among the ethnic Russian territories, and both of them exist on their metropolitan resources and status, which would be impossible without the colonies and their expropriation. Most of the Russian GDP comes from the exploitation of the natural resources, which is well known, and most of them come from the regions such as Yamalo-Nenetsky district or Khanty-Mansiysk. And all of them are heavily disenfranchised. If you will have a look on how the tax is distributed among the regions or the subjects of federation and the central bases, you will see that the federal center enjoys something around 90% of all the tax gathered from, for example, Siberia. For example, from over than 130 billion rubles gathered in tax from the Tomsk region back in 2012, over 92 billion has went to the central budget. The local region, the local people have had only 10 billion for their own disposal. This fact and the facts like it are the reasons why manifestations say enough to feed in Moscow were about to take place in Kuban, Krasnodar and other regions of Russia in 2014. Yet they never took place because they, as well as many others like them, have been prevented by the FSB. What these areas, which are basically feeding Russia with their natural resources, with their fish and coal, with their gas and oil, what do they all get back in return is the plundered land and the ecological catastrophe. Probably the best illustration of how it is done in Russia you get from the Norilsk story. The area, which is one of the richest territories not just in Russia but in the entire world in terms of its natural resources, and also the area which is plundered beyond any imagination. Norilsk is not only the richest, but it is the most polluted area in the world according to all the recent rankings, and it is clearly testified. It is a perfect illustration of how the resources are taken away from the land and the local people, taken with nothing being given to them. There is no infrastructure in Norilsk region except for the one which is needed for the exploitation purposes. There is no special social protection. There are no special additional payments to the local people who are suffering from all the problems with their health deterioration and the mental problems. This what happens to you if you are in Russia.
Ой, извините, а это штуки, чтобы дышать? Ничего себе! Это вам на работе выдают, да?
В цеху работать.
Ага.
Ну, с собой домой носим. Чтобы вот так с работы идешь и не задохнуться. Ну, по городу бывает так хожу.
Да?
Конечно, а вы что, не местная? Вот. Соску приделал, шланг, противогазная банка и пошел работать.
Ага.
Ну, это издержки производства, это нормально практически.
Почему не уехал?
А куда уехать?
А,
Все, мы поехали. Всего хорошего.
да.
With all the horrors of the economic exploitation of the suburbs of Russian Empire, it is still not the worst thing to deal with if you live in Russia and you are not from Moscow and St. Petersburg, especially if you are a part of a minority. Minority which, together with all the other minorities, probably constitute the majority, because Russians are fewer and fewer in the Russian Federation. Yet, they are treated clearly as the people of not even the second, but the third, fourth, people of the last class. The problem is not new, and it has been clearly indicated by the Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the initial Soviet Union. Back in the day, Soviet Union has been in a hell of a trouble. It was not only the economic crisis, but also pretty the entire all other world, which was about to get the communist beast down. It was also the civil war with the white regime of the empire doing its best to come back to power. And yet, with all of these challenges, it was the challenge of chauvinism, the challenge of the discrimination, the challenge of looking down on all the other people but Russians, which Vladimir Lenin indicated as the main challenge of the whole Soviet Union. And yet it seems that this urge did not really help, because later on it was Zinoviev and Bukharin, as well as Stalin, who have constituted that the main challenge of the Soviet Union is this horrible, silly, disgusting, as they admitted themselves, chauvinism. The fact is, in the brotherly unit of the nations, in the unity of the Soviet people, there have always been Russians and all the other guys.
Как вы думаете, как относятся русские к азербайджанцам?
Среди, например, людей стран СНГ, особенно Россия, Белоруссия, так как в любом случае, сколько бы хорошего в какой нации не было, все равно расизм и шовинизм присутствует в России больше всего. И кто бы что бы ни говорил, я не расист, я отношусь ко всем людям одинаково, но к расистам надо относиться соответственно. Если человек расист, я буду к нему относиться как расист. А в России, к сожалению, 85-90% людей это расисты, шовинисты, фашисты, которые они, даже если они вам не скажут, они скрывают внутри, что если ты просто не русский, они просто не будут к тебе хорошо относиться. Вот и все. И даже если они могут хорошо отнестись, они в какой-то момент могут тебе в какой-то определенной ситуации сказать, что вот дело в том, что не русские, и т.д. и т.п. и тому подобное. Я могу из своей жизни, по своему опыту это сказать.
But we do not have to refer to the examples of the Soviet Union if we want to speak about the chauvinism in Russia. Probably the best illustration of it is the language. The language which is depiction, the soul of the nation. If you will have a look on the Russian language and how it is used, it has such words as не русский, which means literally non-Russian, but if going beyond the wording, it means the second class, it means non-civilized, it means something dirty and someone unequal, someone who is not to be allowed to the joint table, someone you do not want to communicate with. There are русские, Russians, and all the other guys who are obviously inferior. The other nice constructions are лицо неславянской внешности, which is the person of non-Slavic outlook, or, for example, лицо кавказской национальности, which is the person of Caucasian origin. The problem is, translation does not really work in this case, because when we translate лицо неславянской внешности, it does not really give you the meaning.
Меня ждут люди, вы издеваетесь, что ли, мразь какая? Довези меня до места! Я сказала, довези меня до места! Тварь! Довези меня до места, мразь! Меня ждут люди! Я сказала, вези, ты специально это сделал, устроил, мразь!
Что я сделал?
Я сказала, меня люди ждут, вези! Я попросила, я тороплюсь, меня люди ждут! Ты сволочь, это из-за того, что я русская, узбек! Ты всех русских ненавидишь!
Почему это я?
Ты всех русских ненавидишь, мразь!
Я не узбек.
Я сказала, вези меня, люди ждут!
Вам сказать,
Тварь.
какой я национальности?
Тварь, вези меня, понял?
А?
Это из-за того, что я русская? Вези меня, тварина!
Нет, я не поеду.
Мразь, я тебе сказала, тварь!
И что?
It does not represent the reality of Russia when the people of non-Slavic regions are not allowed to the first year or even second year jobs, when they are designated with the roles of the taxi drivers or the cleaners, when it is okay for the Russian people to shout on them, to tell them blame words, and they have no protection from the state, no protection from the court, and no protection even from the other people in Russia.
Довези до отделения. И потом телефон положил, уже начал за душа там шею взять, и в угол вытаскивал, и начал с кулаком немножко бить.
Я пересмотрел себе футбол, а? И шапка, а? Что так базаришь, Ты пи***ла, а? Ты чё, а? Тебе чё, балай разобить, а? Чучело, Смотри, блядь, запоминай, ты в риэлторе, понял? Ты куда попал, в какую страну, блядь? Может, у тебя говна найти, блядь? Пару грамм, блядь, поедешь, нахуй, а? Ты, блядь, не у себя в стране, понял? Ты сюда в гости приехал.
Я на работу приеду.
Тем более, блядь. Нехуй тебе здесь работать, блядь. Езжай в свою страну и работай, понял? И там снимай полицейских своих на видео, понял?
If you are non-Slavic origin, you are likely not to get a flat, because if you will check the announcement for the rental housing, there are many of them which directly tell you only to Russian people, or we do not make this offer for the non-Slavic people or the people of Caucasus nationalities. Actually, there is an entire chapter on the Wikipedia on ethnic conflicts in Russia. The pages are different, but the story is pretty the same, as well as the general picture. You have the Russians who have the sentiment of being above all the other nations and extremely suspicious towards all the different nationalities. On the other part of the story, you have these people from Caucasus, from the Central Asia, and actually from any other point of Russia, but from Moscow and St. Petersburg, all the other nationalities, but for Russian nationality.
Еще в 2 часа дня, когда на Манежной площади только начали собираться футбольные болельщики, там было уже около 3000 человек. Но количество людей на площади продолжало расти. Кроме фанатов разных футбольных клубов, сюда пришли представители радикальных молодежных группировок. Массовые беспорядки начались после того, как несколько футбольных фанатов вступили в драку с людьми неславянской внешности.
Не снимайте, пожалуйста, ну!
ОМОНовцы оттеснили нападавших и отнесли 5 пострадавших к машине скорой помощи. Машина была закрыта, пострадавшие пытались спасти прямо под ней. Чтобы защитить их, милиция окружила автомобиль кольцом, но десятки болельщиков попытались пробить оборону ОМОНа, чтобы пройти к машине. ОМОНовцы, вооруженные дубинками, пошли в наступление.
All of these people enjoy not only personal, but also national history of not only disenfranchisement, but also of being looked down, of being third class, of being accepted with disgust or not being accepted at all. As a result of that, there is a huge tension between the people of native Russian origin and of all other nationalities in Russia. And whenever there is a single spark of fire, there would be a flame. In such situations, a conflict of two people grows into the conflict of the entire communities, with the hundreds and sometimes even thousands of people being involved in the conflict, and hundreds of people being taken to the police offices or being injured or even murdered. There is a story of Dagestan and Bashkortostan, the story of Yakutia and Buryatia. Only in 2017 there have been 75 points of ethnical tensions and potential ethnical breakdowns recorded in Russia, and recorded by the conservative, very optimistic Russian researchers. In reality, there are way more of them. The end line is very clear. Whenever you are a Russian or you are a representative of any national minority in Russia, you would not like to stay in the Russian Federation in order for your rights to be respected. If you are Russian, you will have to live in the compromise with the traditions which you do not share. And if you are a people of the minority, you will live in the country which always puts you down.
Красное солнце сгорает дотла, день догорает с ним. На пылающий город падает тень. Перемен требуют наши сердца. Перемен требуют наши глаза. В нашем смехе и в наших слезах, и в пульсации вен. Перемен, мы ждем перемен.
With all of that in mind, the conclusion is inevitable. There is no healthy way for you to live in dignity if you live in Russian Federation. There is no actual security for you in this Russian world, because the real enemy, the enemy which you are suffering from not only today, but throughout the centuries, is within. There is also no same identity, no identity to be shared of and to be used as a basis to build the state solidarity on. On the contrary, the true identity of these people is an identity of the victim of the Russian imperialism. Remember the map of the 1918? Some maps emerge these days for the Russian Federation. These maps represent how the world will look like when Russia will finally fall apart and the nations within this prison will be released. Well, publication of these maps has been criminalized by the central government, and it is very clear why. Because this fear is legitimate. And this is exactly why Putin is praised for his main achievement, keeping Russia together. If you will check the Russian media and Russian politologists, all the political system built to promote the regime, you will get the main point.
Хочу подчеркнуть, что сегодня, исходя из вызовов, которые есть, и, если хотите, угроз, которые в мире существуют, не нефть и газ наше преимущество. Как вы видите, и нефть и газ могут падать в цене. Наше преимущество Путин, и мы его должны защитить.
The whole world tries to take Russia apart, and it is only Putin and his regime who keeps it together.
России смута или даже просто неопределенность в контексте столь серьезных рисков не нужна. И потому, что в мире такая обстановка, и потому, что сама страна еще в процессе формирования.
Много еще пока, но, что называется, сделано, как в народе говорят, на живую нитку. И пока еще очень много уязвимого у нас с вами. Это касается и внутриполитической стабильности, межнационального и межрелигиозного согласия, экономического и социального развития.
На живую нитку, мягко сказано. Будем честными, Россия без Путина еще не жизнеспособна.
As you can see, good things would not work to keep the empire in one piece. There is nothing it can offer to its people in terms of economic benefits, dignity, human rights and natural joint identity. On the other hand, no World War II, no natural enemy to unite against. And here comes racism. And it brings you a good and a bad news. The bad one is, now you live in an extremely dangerous world where enemies are all around you, both in the state and abroad. Over the seas you have the deadly USA and their proxies, NATO, whose only purpose is to plunder rich Russia and tear it apart. Because Russia is ultimate good and the USA is the ultimate evil, and that's exactly what the ultimate evil does.
Угрозы безопасности нашей страны. Мы вновь и вновь вынуждены давать отпор агрессии коллективного Запада.
Inside Russia, you also have American and, as you call them, Anglo-Saxonian agents, filthy traitors of dear motherhood Russia who sell it as their mother for American dollars. These inglorious bastards, ex-Russians who have betrayed their own people, spread the American propaganda and fake news about your glorious rulers and army, trying to delude you with the invented stories such as Bucha, Holodomor, Navalny assassination, Putin palaces, and all the other things which never obviously took place.
Пора вводить понятие «враг народа». Не надо этого стесняться. Враги есть, понятия нет. Причем не только там, которые дебильные приказы отдают, но в том числе здесь, на гражданке, про что мы говорили, все эти ждуны, все остальные, это сволочь, которая в наличии имеется. Мы чего стесняемся? Мне говорят, ты хочешь сталинских репрессий? Я хочу!
They also conspire against you in other states like Ukraine, where they invent horrible biologic weapon designed with this single purpose: destroy Russian people just because they are Russian. That's a horrible, horrible world, and you might wonder how to exist there. Well, here comes the good news. The good news: you have Putin. Putin and his people, who are the only ones capable of protecting you from these fierce foes.
Очень хорошо. Кому спасибо за это?
Всем.
Нет.
Правительство Хабаровска.
Нет. Президенту
России,
Владимиру Владимировичу
Президенту и вам.
Given enough powers, this trustworthy father of the nation and his team will be able to repress all the internal enemies, all the spies and foreign agents to protect the motherland Russia. He might call a father of the 4 children to mobilization. He might prolong your retirement age. He might even stay in power as long as he is basically alive. But that's not a problem, that is actually a blessing. And if you would ever forget about that, you will be kindly reminded by the guy at the TV and by the gentleman knocking at your door at night. But you'd better not to forget.
Пришла полиция в квартиру, забрали его.
1 марта в Тульской области силовики задержали 53-летнего Алексея Москалева, отца 12-летней девочки, нарисовавшей в школе антивоенный рисунок вместо открытки для солдат. Мужчину обвиняют в дискредитации армии.
In the end of the day, when you know Russia as it is, chauvinistic, hateful empire built on exploitation of its rightless colonies, dictatorship and dual reality twisted in the way that even Orwell would be amused, you would not be surprised that Rashism thrives in Russia. Inspirations of the ordinary Russian people, ideology of the church, interests of the regime and the elites, culture, and now the needs of the state, there are all the reasons for Rashism to blossom in Russia. And yet, there is one more reason, one final cause, and probably the most impactful one, which makes the rule of Rashism in Russia simply inevitable. This final root of Rashism is time. The universal laws of inertia and energy conservation. The laws which determine that if something has been imperial aggressive for its entire history, it will remain being so. Remain at least until something colossal would happen. That is, however, for another day. Thank you for your time. If you believe this video to be of value, kindly consider subscribing, liking and commenting it, sharing it within your social circle. This will make us one more step closer to spreading the truth about the Russian war against Ukraine and fighting the Russian propaganda. Thank you again, and see you another day.